So
there we go.
right,
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Robyn Collins, and I'm going to kick off the presentation, followed by my second cousin, once removed, Natalie Jane Prior. As Dina said, Natalie and I made a research trip to Ireland and England earlier this year, and we had a very informative visit to Chesterfield and Clay Cross. And at the outset, we'd really like to acknowledge and thank David Wheatcroft, who showed us around for a day, and also Valerie, who answered many, many questions. And it was so good to have local guidance during our visit. And so thank you once again so much for your expert knowledge and your time. So what were two ladies from Brisbane doing in Derbyshire? Natalie and I are writing a book about a notorious Irish eviction. On 13th of March, 1846, 61 tenants and their families were evicted from the Gerard estate at Ballinlass in East Galway. The landowners were John and Marcella Netterville Gerard, and they wanted to graze cattle, which was a far more profitable option than the multiple sublease arrangement with many tenants on small holdings on their land. The Ballinlass tenants were illiterate, but they were not without resources. They hired a lawyer and fought the eviction through the courts, but eventually they lost. It was the second year of the Great Famine, a time of massive trauma in Ireland. Evictions were common, but this eviction was very widely reported in the press. Daniel O'Connell made speeches about it in the House of Commons. And the Gerards were vilified in the press. And today, in the Mount Bellew area, they're remembered with nothing but contempt. So this line. On the road between Ballygar and Mount Bellew, there is a memorial to the evicted families, and you can see a little bit of that memorial on the screen now. The memorial represents the stone walls of a destroyed cottage with the imprint of bare feet walking away from the wall. The names of the evicted families are recorded. Natalie and I are descendants of Lawrence Kilmartin, whose family was evicted that day. So the book that we're writing is about what happened on the day of the eviction, with the police and the army arriving to tear down the cottages, and the awful events of that day, the events that led up to the eviction, and what happened to one family, that is Lawrence Kilmartin's family. Their story takes us from Galway to England to the coal mines of Clay Cross and County Durham to the US and to Australia. Patrick Kilmartin was about 14 years old when his family was evicted at Ballinlass. What happened to Patrick in the following 20 years or so is a bit of a mystery. But by 1862, he was a coal miner and in County Durham, and it was there that he married Bridget Nyland in 1862. Bridget was also Galway born, but had spent her childhood in Clay Cross. 3 years after they married, Patrick was recruited to build railways in the new colony of Queensland. When we started to get information together about Patrick and Bridget, there was very little documentary evidence about their lives before they came to Australia in 1865. There were just a few family stories that there'd been an eviction, but nobody knew where or what, that a brother named Luke went to America, and that they came to Australia from England. They were Irish, but they came to Australia from England, and that Patrick had been tricked into coming to Queensland. He thought it was in America. The only documentary evidence available at the time were the Queensland birth, marriage and death certificates, which, thanks to the good old British Empire, were detailed and had very useful information. This is the birth certificate for my grandmother, Patrick and Bridget's second youngest child. She was known as Lil in the family. When you look at the birth certificate, you note that a birthplace of the parents is Mount Bellew in Mount Bellew in Galway. But you can see also that they were married in County Durham. Finding answers about what had happened to the family was slow until the advent of digital records. As a matter of fact, I actually went to Mount Bellew twice before I knew about the eviction. With a lot of digging, more information came to light. Yes, the Kilmartins had been evicted from the Gerard estate in East Galway Yes, a brother named Luke, plus 3 sisters, had migrated to the US. And yes, Patrick probably had been tricked into coming to Queensland. And we found 10-year-old Bridget Nyland in 1851, living with her family and her mother's family, the Dooleys, in Clay Cross. As you all know, a coal mining boom town in Derbyshire.
Oh, sorry.
So it's over to Natalie.
So I'm going to start off by explaining the area in Galway we're talking about, and this map comes from John Grenham's Irish Ancestor site, which, if you are interested in Irish genealogy, is a really useful gateway to a lot of material. It is a subscription site, unfortunately, but you can take out a subscription for a day or a month, which makes it not so expensive. Really, just to give you an idea of the location, we'll describe it as the strip of Galway that runs down the border with the adjoining county of Roscommon. And on the right-hand side of this picture, you'll see where that is. It's just easier than messing around with Ordnance Survey maps. We'll get onto those as we move on with the conversation. And this is a more close-up sort of view of some of the areas that we're talking about. You'll see there's a pin in the map. This is a place called Spring Lawn, and I know there are people, apart from us tonight, who have connections with this place. It's between the small towns of Mount Bellew and Mylor. And tonight we are going to be talking largely about a couple of specific families, and this is almost certainly where they came from. But for the big picture stuff, when we're talking about people moving from East Galway to the Chesterfield and Clay Cross area, those refugees could have come from anywhere along that border. The other thing that you need to keep in the back of your mind, just when people from Ireland describe where they came from, they usually gave the name of the townland. In Irish land management, a townland is basically a small defined district. They're marked on the Ordnance Survey maps. They're used to identify land in leases, sales, all sorts of local matters. So Spring Lawn is a townland. Ballinlass that Robyn has been talking about is a townland. And in those townlands, you find small villages or hamlets, effectively just clusters of houses. In Irish, these are called clachans, and they tend to be based around families. The usual practice when children got married was for the parents to divide up their bit of land and give some to the newlyweds, so that you get these multi-generational settlements of people, all with the same names, which from a genealogical perspective can be quite difficult to untangle. So let's just at this point go back to this area as it was in the 1840s. You are looking at a more or less completely rural area. Most of the local people there were Irish speakers, so plenty, particularly the men, for reasons which we'll get to, were bilingual in English. There's no industry. The closest the area had to it was linen weaving, and that died off in the early part of the 19th century, first as a result of tariffs, and then because cotton goods from the mills in Lancashire were just cheaper. A lot of the land was quite poor. It had been overworked, and there were substantial tracts of bog, and above all, it was heavily overpopulated. Between 1821 and 1841, the population of Ireland is generally believed to have increased by 20%, but the rate of increase in this part of the country was much higher than the national average, which I'll just show you. So if you have a look at this graph, you can see what the population increase looked like for two of the civil parishes, which we've been personally researching. The people at the bottom of the social ladder, the labourers who would hire themselves out on a daily basis, cottiers, small farmers even, were really living from one rent day to the next. Most of these people would have had no contact with their landlord. They were paying rent to middlemen or head tenants who would have probably marked up the little strips of land to almost impossible rates. The chap who was the head tenant at Ballinlass was called Wealthy Tom Gavin for a reason. A lot of the other inhabitants were his own relatives, and he was absolutely rorting them. Living this way meant that a huge percentage of the population was very vulnerable if something went wrong, which of course we know it did. The first signs of the potato blight were spotted in this area sometime in August 1845, and it spread very quickly. In November, a local landlord called Dennis Kelly, who was one of the deputy lieutenants of Galway, wrote this to Sir Thomas Fremantle at Dublin Castle. I really never was more shocked than at seeing the wretched blackened potatoes the miserable inhabitants were endeavouring to make a meal of. By February at the latest, and I should fear by New Year's Day, their entire stock will be exhausted and close on 4,000 human beings will be actually starving. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of the famine because honestly, having sat in the archives and read the original distress reports for this area, it is just horrific to the point where you can barely get your head around it. And it's not the focus for tonight. So I'll just say that the west of Ireland generally was hit extremely badly, and anything horrible you've heard or read about the famine was probably happening in this area. I will show you one more graph though to just give you an idea of the impact the famine had on East Galway. If we go back to that graph I showed you before and add in the statistics for 1851, again, there's these two parishes. So 1821, 1841, increasing. And then, whoa, I mean, that's quite scary. I mean, in Ballynakill between 1841 and 1851, just short of 1,000 people, which is 56% of the population just evaporated. Mm. So where did all these people go? Mm. Well, I think we know the answer to that. Mm. The people who stayed in the district tended to be the ones with good landlords. Some landlords were supportive, but a lot were broke, couldn't help even if they wanted to, and some, like the Gerards, were just absolutely awful. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on the subject of evictions, but there were a lot of evictions in this area. To give you an idea, John and Marcella Gerard had been clearing land to make way for cattle since the early 1820s, and Ballinlass was the fourth big eviction they carried out. And, after that, despite the bad publicity, they just kept on doing it. And so these are some of, oops, I've gone back to front somehow here. Yeah, these are some of the local landlords. Gone backwards. So one of the places where there very probably was an eviction was at a townland called Spring Lawn. There were 2 villages at Spring Lawn in the Ordnance Survey done in 1839. By the time of Griffith's valuation in the 1850s, one of those villages has completely disappeared. So this obviously suggests an eviction. A good way of actually seeing where the evictions happen is if you look at the census figures for 1841 and 1851 in the records, you can see where it's listed by townlands. You can see the drop in population, and you can see the drop in the number of houses. Basically, they've been demolished. And we also have some anecdotal evidence about an eviction at Spring Lawn. In the early 1850s, a Spring Lawn resident by the name of Hart was hauled up before the magistrates for threatening to hire a hitman to shoot the landlord with whom he was arguing over an eviction. And in case you want to know where you got a hitman from in 1850s Galway, You went over the border to Roscommon, which is where all the bad people came from, and you paid him 10 shillings. So I will just show you, I got the slides out of order despite all my efforts. So I'll just go forward. This is some of the local landlords. It's not a comprehensive list, but just to give you an idea of what you're dealing with. So some were supportive, but some just couldn't help, wouldn't help. So it was not a good situation. So resident at Spring Lawn in the 1840s. Now, this again is not a comprehensive list, but I've put these names up because these names all turn up in the records in Clay Cross. Okay, you have these people: Nylands, Dooleys, Higgins, Donlans, Burns, Quinns, and Flemings. And when you look at the parish register for Mylor, you can actually see that these people are very closely connected, intermarried. They're godparents to each other's children, they're witnesses to each other's marriages. And while some of them also appear in the land records, a lot of them don't, which means that they would have been labourers or under tenants, who are the very people who would have been most vulnerable.
Natalie's spoken about the Great Famine, but by the third year of the Great Famine, the survivors and the evictees were pouring into Liverpool. The government totally failed to provide effective relief, and if landlords were not supportive, then people had no option but to leave. It's estimated that about 300,000 people landed in Liverpool from Ireland in 1847. Most transited to North America, but many of them stayed. As Natalie has pointed out, although the economy of Galway was agricultural and the people were quite isolated in small villages, and there was also the fact that most of them did not speak English, they were not totally ignorant of the outside world. In the 1840s, there'd been an expansion in the publication of newspapers, plus an increase in literacy in Ireland. Those who could read English read to others. Priests and ministers read to their congregations. But most importantly, in the decades before the Great Famine, the annual seasonal movement of agricultural workers in the west of Ireland to England to bring in the harvest meant that knowledge of work opportunities in England, both in agriculture and in all of the new industries that were happening in England, filtered back to the villages. In the villages and townslands, it was a seasonal life. The potatoes were planted in spring along with a cash crop. That is, if the tenant actually had land to plant. Many men went to the English Midlands in the summer to bring in the harvest. This created cash to pay the rent, to buy a pig or a cow, to marry, or to pay the fare to America. Seasonal labour supported a growing population in a rural economy. They knew that there was work in England building railways and in factories and mines, and they knew that unskilled workers could get jobs in the coal mining industry and in Derbyshire. Leaving home, not speaking English were barriers to immigration, but those barriers became surmountable with the disaster caused by the failure of the potato crop. So, how did they get to England? Before the railways, Charles B. and Coney developed a network of passenger coaches across Ireland. If you had the fare, you could get to a port and then take a boat to England. From Galway, coastal ferries operated to Liverpool. The main passenger and freight services were on the two canals, the Grand Canal and the Royal Canal, which followed the rivers from the interior to Dublin, where you could get a ferry to England. At the height of the famine, evictees from the Mahon estate at Strokestown in County Roscommon walked the 145 kilometres to Dublin along the Royal Canal towpath to get a ferry to Liverpool and then a boat to Canada. If you have a look at the picture on the left, that's the Royal Canal at Maynooth, taken on a beautiful day in June. The towpaths did provide a way to walk to Dublin. I mean, that picture looks pretty idyllic. But that is if you're healthy, have food, and not walking with sick children and all your worldly possessions. There are many accounts of the experiences of the poorest passengers on ferries to England. The cheapest fares meant that you travelled on the deck, where you were at the mercy of the weather. Cattle typically travelled on the lower decks, where they were protected from the weather. Sylvester Redmond, who wrote extensively in the Freeman's Journal about the Ballinlass eviction, described a typical voyage across the Irish Sea in a submission that he made to a government inquiry on immigration. He said, "I have seen 100 to 300 passengers exposed on the deck. I have seen the sea washing over the deck, completely drenching the unfortunate people. On one morning, I saw between 50 and 60 people, including 5 children, perfectly cold and stiff, while the livestock was under cover and well cared for." The average passage of steamers to Liverpool is 14 hours. Not for the first time, the well-being of cattle counted more than the welfare of human beings. Railways reached Galway in 1851 when the line from Dublin was complete and stations were opened in Galway City, Athenry, Ballinasloe. This is one of the railway stations on the right in Galway. Of course, the railways made it far easier to travel. No, the next one, thanks, Natalie. In the centre of the screen, there is a short extract from an article that appeared in the Derbyshire Courier, Chesterfield Gazette, and the General County Advertiser that was published in August 1853. I love the title of that newspaper. The reporter voices concerns about the supply of seasonal agricultural workers from Galway being impacted by growing migration to America. He says that agricultural workers should be supported to come to Derbyshire for the harvest. He describes a typical journey from Galway. He says that a poor man in Galway can be at work in a Derbyshire farm 48 hours after leaving home. First, he travels to Dublin, buying a 4th-class rail ticket, then overnight to Liverpool or to Holyhead, and then another train north. As described, the journey is quick and efficient. He also claims that the cost is now affordable for most poor men. Clearly, the arrival of the railways in Galway made travel to England less challenging. Seasonal migration continues, but it's overtaken by permanent migration. From about 1846, surnames from East Galway start appearing in the Derbyshire records. Natalie.
Okay. So you've begged, borrowed, stolen a fare to get on that boat. You've walked, you've caught trains, however you've got there, and you've arrived in Clay Cross. So what do you do when you arrive in a new place and have to find somewhere to live? Obviously, you make contact with people you might know or who have been recommended to you, people who speak the same language and with whom you have something in common, people who can be relied on to support you and hopefully not rip you off. In the early 1850s, if you arrived in Clay Cross from East Galway, one of the people you would probably look out for was a woman called Catherine Nyland. Catherine and her family arrived in Clay Cross quite early on, around the end of 1849, and we can date that pretty accurately from the surviving records. Her maiden name was Dooley, so hi to all the other Dooley relatives. It does seem that this movement from Galway to Chesterfield was a Dooley migration rather than a Nyland one. There are lots of related Dooleys in the Clay Cross records, but only one other related Nyland. Catherine and her husband, John Nyland, moved into 2 houses in 3 and 4 Homegate Row. And in 1851, when they do the census, you can find that Catherine is running what was effectively a slum boarding house for people from East Galway. So we've got these people here. We've got John and Catherine and their 4 children. You'll see there's a big gap in age between Bridget, who's 10, and Martin, who's 5. Given the regularity with which she had children, there must have been kids born between those 2 who no doubt perished in the famine. Thomas and John Dooley, who are probably Catherine's young nephews, And as well as those family members, there are 12 additional boarders with East Galway surnames. Those names that I've put there, Connaught, Miskell, Donlan, Higgins, Burns, these are all East Galway surnames. And there are Donlans, Higgins, Burns, Atspring, Lawn, and the Higgins are very intermarried with the Nylans and Dooleys. Miskell is a really localised surname. Most people with that name come from East Galway. So all up, the Nylans had 14 boarders living with them in their houses at Clay Cross, and 12 of them were young men. All of these men were, and also John Nyland, were working in the coal mines, mostly in very menial jobs as putters, i.e. putting coal into tubs and moving them around. They are presumably working different shifts and hotbedding, because I don't see how you do it otherwise. But when you think about the size of those houses, and I think the environment living in them would have been pretty awful. We also see this pattern repeated at numbers 5 and 6 Homegate Row, which are occupied by 2 families called Gannon. And again, this is another name from our area. In number 5, there are 12 residents. In number 6, there are 11. And I will also just note that one of the Gannon families has a small child who was evidently born in Clay Cross in 1848. So this is, again, dating the arrival of these people into the area. And there are a few uninhabited houses, which suggests that the Irish arrivals might be moving into accommodation that may be less desirable to other people, or, you know, just perhaps it was just what they could get, because impoverished Irish miners were not particularly popular as neighbours. If you were living in Homegate Row in 1851, the average occupancy of the row houses was about 4 or 5 people, and they're mostly nuclear families or couples. Are those families going to be pleased to suddenly get 40 famine refugees crammed into a couple of little row houses as new neighbours? It's 40 people coming and going, and frankly, apart from anything else, I'd be less than thrilled that I now had to share my extremely limited sanitation facilities with 40 Irish miners. But they have to live somewhere. So moving on to the 1861 census for Clay Cross, we find Catherine and John Nyland running another very similar boarding house behind the Nag's Head pub. That's still there today, and that was a photograph we took when we were there. If you went through the archway, which David told us is called a Gennell locally, there were 4 tiny houses crammed into Holt's Yard, which is a little tiny yard behind the pub. And this time they're full of Irish railway navvies. So when you get a lot of people living in crowded conditions like this, and bear in mind those famine refugees in the late 40s and early 50s would not have been in good physical shape when they arrived, you get disease. And so, of course, we know who we're going to blame. So this is what the poor people were living like. So the sanitary condition of the Irish labourers is deplorable. Their habitations are extremely filthy, emitting the most offensive effluvia. These observations apply to the homes of about 1,000 people resident in Chesterfield and the immediate neighbourhood. Now that's 1854. I'd like to say if you had 20 people living in a tiny house, I don't see how you could avoid living like that and having those conditions. But anyway, 12 years later, nothing much has changed. The dreadful alleys and courts inhabited by the Irish colliers must be attended to as soon as possible, and sorry, I've lost my thing, and an effort made to purify these hotbeds of infectious disease. None but those who have visited some of these places within a few yards of main thoroughfares, you know, behind the Nag's Head, can form any idea of their unutterable filth and general disobedience to the laws of health. So this is the big problem. And, you know, there were outbreaks of typhus and scarlatina and different diseases, and every time you can see that they're tied to people living like this. This is the big problem. Irish labour was absolutely necessary for local industry to function. You heard Robyn saying that, you know, they're actually worried that people were going to migrate to America and not come to England and they'd be short of labour. But the local people resented having them there. And as the 1850s progressed and more Irish refugees moved into the Chesterfield-Clay Cross area, the friction between the English and the Irish started to ramp up. And of course, it's not the Irish people who are writing the newspapers. So when you read them, you're not going to get stories about people going meekly off to mass on Sunday morning. You're going to get the usual Irish stereotypes of dirtiness, drunkenness, brawling. Clay Cross was a rough, rapidly expanding industrial town. 19th century miners were not normally known for gentlemanly behaviour. So, of course, you're going to get problems like this. Sometimes it was the English who started up the trouble. So you get incidents like one in 1855, when about a dozen English miners ganged up on 4 Irishmen who were on their way to work and beat them up. Completely unprovoked attack. Didn't need a motive. They were Irish. They were there. Hey, it's the 19th century. We're allowed to be racist. And then there were rows that the Irish started, either with the English or among themselves. Don't forget, these people in this refugee community weren't just displaced. They had been through the famine, which would have been absolutely horrific. And in modern terms, they were all probably suffering from PTSD. It didn't take much to tip them over the edge, particularly when their only social life was going to the pub. Now, at this point, we are talking about negative Irish stereotypes. I have a confession. Robyn and I, and some of you, have embarrassing relatives. I don't particularly care for the word gang, so let's just say that the Dooleys, Martin, Thomas, Larry, William, Patrick, and John Dooley were well known to police, as the usual euphemism has it. There was one particular policeman in Clay Cross called Inspector Fern. They were always beating up. I personally feel rather sorry for him. Otherwise, they were constantly in trouble for drunken fights, running illegal stills, and assaulting their female relatives. Generally, they are not the sort of ancestor you are going to be feeling very proud of. But there is one Dooley story which we want to share. There was, in those days, a pub in Clay Cross High Street called the Red Lion, where the Dooleys used to drink. And they were always getting on the wrong side of the landlady, a quite redoubtable woman called Anne Hodgkinson. Anyway, on this particular occasion, they were making a nuisance of themselves at the pub, and Mrs. Hodgkinson tried to throw them out. So things got nasty. One of them hit her over the head with a bottle, or tried to. Cue Inspector Fern. He turns up, makes an arrest. And Thomas Dooley was put on trial for assault. At this point, the whole thing descends into a kind of black farce, because the Dooleys start fighting in the courtroom over which one of them had actually committed the assault. So Thomas is on trial. He's the one on trial, but the other brothers gang up on Martin and blame him. Then Mrs. Hodgkinson takes exception to being cross-examined by Thomas as a defence attorney. She told him that if Thomas had not done anything wrong, he would have had no occasion to employ a lawyer. And then the barmaid, who's a girl called Kitty Fleming, got up and swore that it could possibly have been the Dooleys, because it was a lemonade bottle and, oops, got a matter wrong. None of the party was drinking lemonade. The judge wasn't impressed, and Thomas Dooley was found guilty. But in case you think that Kitty Fleming was a disinterested party, not long after this, she also ended up on a charge of assaulting Mrs. Hodgkinson and subsequently got married to Thomas Dooley. And on that high point, I think I have said enough and will hand you back to Robyn.
Okay, so what happened to the Nyland family next? Before I go on, I just have to say that Those of you who live in Clay Cross will know that miners were at that time paid in pubs. I think they were on a hiding to nothing, but the culture of alcohol was all around them. It was a difficult place to be. The Nyland family left Clay Cross in 1861 and moved north to the coal mines at Coundon, which is near Bishop Auckland in County Durham. We know that they were in Clay Cross in April when the 1861 census was taken, but later that year they relocated to Coundon, where their youngest child, Stephen, was born on the 21st of September. It's possible that the Clay Cross inrush, which happened in June 1861, may have prompted their move north. Water from a disused pit flooded a working pit, causing the death of 23 miners, including 4 who were just 13, 14 years old. Clay Cross is often described as a tough town. Maybe they wanted to change. Maybe they needed to get away from the doolies. Just thought of that.
The doolies had already gone there first.
Doolies have gone there
The Nylands followed the doolies.
Well, maybe they followed their relatives, or maybe they just wanted to change. Who knows? Bridget is not listed in the 1861 census with the rest of the family at Clay Cross. Natalie's already shaking her head.
She's run away from the doolies.
There is a Bridget Nyland in the 1861 census working as an agricultural labourer in Selby in Yorkshire. I'd like to think it might be her, but Natalie's very sceptical about that. However, what we do know was that Bridget was in the Bishop Auckland area in 1862, because that is when she married Patrick Kilmartin at St. Wilfrid's Catholic Church in Bishop Auckland. And there's a picture of St. Wilfrid's. St. Wilfrid's is a really interesting church because it was built about 20 years before Irish immigration into the area. So it was probably built by English Catholics who were very prominent in the area at the time. When Bridget and Patrick got married in that little church, when Natalie and I went there, we weren't able to get in, but it could see that it was still being used, and there were lovely little flowers around it, and
Very well kept.
And very well kept. When they got married, Patrick was a coal miner. We don't know if they knew one another as children in East Galway. Probably not, but who knows? So we don't know where they met or how long Patrick had been in England or had been in the Durham area. But what we do know is that just 3 years after marrying, they were on a ship to Australia. Queensland separated from New South Wales and became a separate colony in 1859. The new government wanted young, strong, healthy people to come to Queensland ready to work. To this end, they appointed an immigration commissioner, one Henry Jordan, who was based in London. His mission was to lease ships for migrants and to recruit British and German migrants. He set up a system of local recruitment agents. At the time, nobody knew anything about Queensland. It was a new place, a place with a new name. So Henry Jordan gave public lectures around Britain about this new place, Queensland. He was scheduled to give a public lecture in Durham to lure migrants to Queensland, but the local agent had recruited nobody. A ship was due to leave for Brisbane. The agent managed to recruit 2 families before his boss arrived to give the lecture. So within 2 weeks of signing up, the 2 families were on a ship to Brisbane, and one of those families was the family of Patrick and Bridget Kilmartin. This is a picture of Bridget Kilmartin in her old age with her granddaughter, Hilda Hogberg. If you look very closely at her hands, I think the hands are of someone who worked hard all her life. And I think those hands tell us that she was an agricultural labourer in Selby. Convinced, Natalie?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Patrick and Bridget arrived with their young daughter, Catherine, in Brisbane on the 1st of January, 1866. Their baby son, Lawrence, had died on the voyage. When he came to Australia, Patrick left coal mines behind him. He worked as a navvy building railways, and in his later years, he operated a railway level crossing gate near a farming town. Most of their 10 Australian children were born in railway construction camps. There is a story in our family that someone bought Patrick drinks in a pub in Durham and he signed up to work building railways in Queensland, and that he was told that Queensland was in the United States. At the time, his brother Luke and his 3 sisters were in Iowa. So we think that the story is probably true, that he thought that Queensland was some new place in the United States. Certainly, Patrick Kilmartin and Bridget Nyland were the only members of their families to migrate to Australia. They were the outliers. They were the siblings who disappeared. When we started doing some work about this, about the family, there wasn't a lot of documentary evidence for us. But interestingly, there wasn't a lot of documentary evidence, and it was quite difficult to get the Patrick and Bridget Kilmartin story right. But Bridget had a brother who also went to the United States. Her youngest brother, Stephen, who was 20 years younger than him, went to the United States in 1882. In the 1881 census, we can find Stephen, 19-year-old Stephen, in Clay Cross, working as a coal miner. His father, John Nyland, is also in that census, working in Clay Cross. But the following year, he left for the United States. It would appear that he followed family to the United States, and our Dooley relatives who are watching this probably know far more about this than we do. Because at least one of his mother's family, the Dooleys, had migrated to the coal mines of Pennsylvania. Now, what you see on the screen is Stephen's application to become a citizen of the United States. And you can see, interestingly, that where he arrived, the port of entry when he arrived was Philadelphia. At the time, it was far more common for migrants to go to New York, to Boston. Philadelphia had a migration station from about 1870. So migrants were coming there, but it was a longer journey. You had to go down the coast and around to get to Philadelphia. So clearly, if he was going to Philadelphia, he had a reason for it. And probably that reason was that he was joining family in Pennsylvania. You can also see on the page his place of birth, which is Bishop Auckland.
Oops,
in England.
Went too fast.
Yeah, I'm too fast.
There.
And the other interesting thing that's on this page is the birthplaces of all his children, which we will come to. And you can clearly see that Stephen ended up working in Utah. And one of the other interesting things is that name, Lawrence Dooley, keeps coming up. And you can see that his 3rd child was named Lawrence Dooley Nyland. How and why Stephen ended up in Utah is a bit of a mystery. Like I said, it's assumed that he went to his Dooley family in the coal mining area near Mount Carmel in Pennsylvania. And sometime in the following 10 or so years, he moved to Utah. Utah, of course, is synonymous with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. It's interesting that the Mormons were also a presence in Derbyshire. They were a proselytizing church. They did missionary work. They were interested in recruiting people to their faith. And a number of mines in Utah were worked by British miners who had converted and moved to Utah. So perhaps Stephen formed an interest in the Mormon faith, or perhaps he just moved west with mining work. But what we do know is that around about 1894, he entered into a relationship with Cyrena Dyson Engel. Cyrena was born into a Mormon family in Utah. At the young age of 15 years, she was the 2nd wife in a polygamous marriage with James Engel. And you can see a picture of James Engel.
He's coming up.
He's coming up.
There he is.
There he is. Interestingly, he did missionary work in Pennsylvania. Found that out recently and haven't followed that one through. But Serena had 6 children with James Engel in Utah. And those of you who know a little bit about the Mormon Church will know that the church outlawed polygamy in 1890. Utah wanted to join the Union as a state. It was a territory up until that point. And one of the conditions from Congress was that the church outlawed polygamy. A few years after polygamy was outlawed, James Engel was arrested and convicted of cohabitation. He spent some time in a penitentiary. Soon after that, we see that Stephen and Cyrena have become partners. She brought some of her children to the marriage. We don't know when and how this happened. There is a marriage date, but no documentary evidence to date. Sadly, she died in 1907, giving birth to her 14th child. Now, sorry, Natalie, can we just go back again? Sorry. The interesting thing about this is where the children were born. The first child was born in McFerrin, Colorado. I haven't been able to find where McFerrin, Colorado is. But the other places, Castlegate, Schofield, are coal mining towns. So can we just go back? Whoa, there goes James Engel again. What you see on the screen here on the right is a coal mining town in Utah called Schofield. Schofield was largely settled by coal miners from Britain who were converts to the Mormon faith. The mine owner-manager was a Brit who was a bishop in the Mormon Church. This particular mine had a good reputation for safety, but in 1900, this all came crashing down. A spark ignited coal dust underground. 100 men were killed instantly, and with a further 99 dying soon after. Given that Schofield was the birthplace of one of his children, and around about the time, it's very likely that Stephen worked in this mine. The picture that you can see there is them taking the bodies away from the disaster. On the left, you see another mining town called Castlegate. In 1900, Stephen Nyland is listed as a non-fatal injury in a mining accident at Castlegate. The other claim to fame that Castlegate has is that Butch Cassidy did a hold up there with an accomplice. And that's kind of funny because we know that some of the Kilmartin descendants lived in a town that Jesse James robbed a train in, which we find that quite interesting. Castlegate was the birthplace of a number of Stephen and Cyrena's children. It was there in 1907 that she died. After these mines, by the way, are now long closed, and Castlegate in particular is a ghost town. After his wife died, many of the children were adopted into Mormon families. Stephen died in Salt Lake City in 1944. Interestingly, his funeral service was at the Catholic Cathedral in Salt Lake City, and he's buried in the Catholic cemetery, which I find very interesting. His daughter, Kathleen, was the informant for his death certificate. Let's go back to Pennsylvania, because we know that Stephen ended up in Pennsylvania, in Utah, but we think it's highly likely that he spent time with his family in Dooleyville. Now, Dooleyville is in the Pennsylvania coal country. It's not actually a town, it's a place. And it's a place that is linked to Martin Dooley, who was probably Stephen's cousin. Martin Dooley was born in Galway in 1839. By 1861, he was a coal miner at Clay Cross. And Lawrence Dooley, there's that name again, was his father. It would appear that Martin immigrated to Pennsylvania in the mid-1860s. Coal mining was a major industry in Pennsylvania. Many of the miners were immigrants, and many of them were poor, and the conditions in the mines in Pennsylvania at that time were particularly hard. During that time, before the 1880s, many attempts were made to establish a union, but these attempts were met with great opposition from the mine owners, which of course is a common theme. A number of terrorist acts were blamed on the Irish secret society, the Molly Maguires. Mine owners engaged the Pinkerton Detective Agency to infiltrate and gather evidence. Between 1876 and 1879, 19 men, miners, were accused and executed for supposed terrorist activities undertaken by the Molly Maguires. One of those men who was executed was Patrick Hester, who was Martin Dooley's father-in-law. There's
was it brother-in-law?
Well,
the Dooley people will know.
The Dooley people will know better than this for us about whether he was father-in-law or brother-in-law. There's considerable debate over the actual existence of the Molly Maguires as a terrorist organisation. That there were murders and violence is not in doubt. However, the mine owners opposed attempts by the workers to unionise, and the law was stacked against the accused. The district attorney was a prominent mine owner. The police force was employed by the mine owners, though it wasn't a county or a state police force. It was the mine police force. And the men were convicted mostly on hearsay evidence. Dooleyville is described as a patch of land near Mount Carmel, which is in the historic mining area of Pennsylvania. Martin Dooley was described as an innkeeper. It would probably be impossible for an ex-miner from Clay Cross to not know about the conditions in the mines and to not be sympathetic to the plight of the miners and to not know a few Molly Maguires. That is, if they did exist as a terrorist organisation.
Whatever. I
think that Natalie and I think that Stephen Nyland's story in the US is fascinating. He creates a link from coal mining in Clay Cross in England, the Midlands, to Pennsylvania and to Utah. And we think that his story is very worthy of much greater investigation. Of course, in a book about the eviction, the story of Stephen Nyland will just be a small part. But I'm quite sure that there are people
who, a couple of paragraphs.
It might only be half a page or so. But I'm quite sure that for people who live in Clay Cross and who are interested in the history of that area, that his story might have resonance and it might be one that you might be interested in.
Anyway, over to me. And so we're just going to finish up with a few practicalities. So how can I tell if my Irish-born Chesterfield area ancestors fit into this Galway diaspora? Well, let's have a few pointers. The first thing I'm going to do is show you a very interesting chart, which is based on the 1861 census. Now, one of the really frustrating things about English census enumerators is that when they recorded Irish residents, most of them just wrote Ireland for the place of birth. However, in the 1861 census in the Chesterfield area, some of the enumerators, did trouble to include Irish counties of origin. Now, we don't have this information for all of the Irish-born residents of the area, but there was a decent enough number that I think we can actually draw some general conclusions. This is indicative, but the interesting statistic is that of the people whose place of birth was listed, 47% of the Irish in Chesterfield and Clay Cross are described as being from Galway. Mayo, the next biggest, with 15%, is of course an adjoining county. You'd expect a reasonable number of people to come from Dublin. Well, the rest of them are all pretty much the same, and there are frankly some that just didn't even register. 47% is a really big percentage. So the first thing I would say to people who suspect that they might have a connection is that if you don't know the origin of your Irish-born ancestor, go to the west of Ireland first. The odds are more than even that that is where they came from. The other big thing that is an indicator is surnames. Now, throughout this talk, Robyn and I have been referring to East Galway surnames. Well, any area does have localised surnames to some extent, but it seems to us anyway that in Ireland this tendency is on steroids. When we started working on this project and we made Martin Curley's contact with Martin Curley, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, Martin was always saying, oh yes, that's an East Galway name. Oh yes, he's from an area. Well, after a few years of working on this project, we know what he means. Robyn and I have now reached the point where we look at the names in census records or parish registers, and we can immediately pick up the ones that come from our area. So this is not a list that's complete. It's just some common names that we regularly encounter and have been working with. As I said before, Miskel, for example, is incredibly localised. Diskin is another very localised one. Out of curiosity, I looked up the 1861 census to see if there were any Diskins in Chesterfield. Found 2 young men, both called Thomas, living in one of those packed Irish lodging houses like the Nylands, and sure enough, they're from Galway. There are some good resources for Irish surnames, but if you want to focus on where people come from, I highly recommend John Grenham's site, Irish Ancestors. As I said at the beginning, it is a subscription site, but you can join for a day or a month, which makes it more affordable if you just want to look up a few things, which probably is most of us. The site's also fabulous for generating maps, and you can do really localized research. So, for example, I typed in a surname search for Diskin, and it generated this report and map for me. You can see where the Diskins come from. There's, you know, all of the different things that you can check here, and then variant spellings. John Grenham is also the author of the Standard Guide to Irish Genealogy. So knowing some basic details, you can just then start and do your usual genealogical cross-checking. I will mention just a couple of things that might help with this. Another site, and I'm sorry, yes, it is another subscription, is Roots Ireland. The thing that's really fabulous about this one is that for some areas, including ours, they have indexed all the godparents and the witnesses to marriage, which you don't get with other sites. This is so helpful to find out how individuals are connected to each other. And when you're dealing with patchy records, it's another way of working out if someone was living in an area. I left the best bit to last. I mentioned Martin Curley. Martin is a local historian and genealogist in Mount Bellew. And for some years now, he's been the administrator of the East Galway Genealogy and DNA project. It was quite interesting that Valerie said your next talk's going to be on this subject. Martin's project operates via a private but very large Facebook group. Some of you I know are attending because you saw it this talk advertised on the group. There's an associated GEDmatch project that goes with it. If you have done any Irish genealogy, you will know that the records can be really patchy. So many things were lost in the Four Courts fire, all of the census returns, for example. But the wonderful thing about Irish DNA is that though the diaspora has spread all over the world, there is a lot of it. And if you get enough samples to do really good cross-checking, and thanks to Martin, again, who has cajoled and encouraged and donated kits and spent more time than I think any of us can really appreciate, the East Galway group now has a very large DNA reference set that's achieved amazing results for us and for a lot of other people as well. We are very lucky in our family because one of the grandchildren of the original Ballinlass evictees, the very sprightly 102-year-old Gloria Collins, only 2 generations away from the Famine, has been an enthusiastic contributor to the project. And honestly, I cannot tell you how much joy it has given her, and indeed the rest of us, to connect to our family in Galway. Johnny, our lovely cousin, who I know is watching, talks to Gloria every day, and it has just been such a tremendous experience to find out how our family, which on Friday the 13th of March 1846 was thrown out into the ditch on the side of the road like so much garbage and left to starve, which was broken up and scattered to the ends of the earth, has produced so many gifted, successful and talented people, some of whom are watching. So if you think you have East Galway ancestry, join this project. ask us, ask Martin, look it up on Facebook, but join this project.